Multiple devices එකවර connect කළ හැකි. Internet like a boss. SLT Mobitel Fiber. Multiple devices එකවර connect කළ හැකි. Internet like a boss. SLT Mobitel Fiber.
In your headlines tonight, compounding matters, fuel crisis and shortage of pharmaceutical drugs could lead to a collapse in the healthcare system, warn state medical officers. No room for corruption. IMF agreement with Sri Lanka must come with a host of critical reforms, United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee says. Queues no more. Laughs gas to expand LPG distribution, while state supplier Litro assures non-stop supply for 16 months. And fuel shipments expected by Lanka IOC mid-month. Good faith. Japan dispels misinformation regarding stance on Sri Lanka, says $3 million will be provided in emergency funding. All this and much more coming up tonight, this Saturday, the 2nd of July, 2022.
නව ලයිෆ් බොයි කොහොම ස්වභාවික කොහොම සාරය සමග හානිකර පැරබන් රහිතයි.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
A very warm welcome. You're joining us on AdaDerana English News, and I'm Indivari Amwathad. And in your top story tonight, the Government Medical Officers Association says that health professionals are faced with dual crises, with one being the fuel shortage and the other being the shortage of medication in the country. The association stated that health officials, ranging from specialists to minor staff, have spent an increased amount of time at fuel queues this week compared to the last, thus raising fears that the trend, unless solved, could lead to the downfall of the healthcare system in the country. Meanwhile, privately run Lanka Indian Oil Company shed a positive light announcing of the arrival of 2 shipments of fuel to Colombo during this month and another in August.
Due to the shortage of fuel in the country, supplies at refilling stations are issued on a priority basis to essential services and for power generation. As part of this, health personnel are allocated Friday as the day dedicated to obtain fuel from dedicated fuel stations across the country. Yesterday, even though health officials queued up at various refilling stations, they were severely inconvenienced due to the lack of fuel and due to the tensions at refilling stations. Such inconveniences threaten and reduce the time that medical personnel could spend at hospitals providing care for patients. The Government Medical Officers Association says that medical staff are faced with severe difficulty, not in just finding essentials for the day-to-day needs, but also to fulfill their professional responsibilities.
විශේෂයෙන් රජයේ රෝහල් වල බරපතල ඖෂධ හිඟයක් නිර්මාණය වෙලා තියෙනවා. එක බෙහෙතක් නැති වුණත් ඒ වෙනුවට තියෙන තවත් විකල්ප ඖෂධයක් පාවිච්චි කරලා අපිට ජීවිත බේර ගන්න පුළුවන් තත්ත්වයක අපි පත් වෙලා ඉන්නවා දැනට. බෙහෙත් වල තොග රිප්ලේස් වුන් නැත්නම් ඉදිරි සති දෙක තුන ඇතුළත මේ අත්‍යවශ්‍ය ජීවිතාරක්ෂක ඖෂධ පවා බරපතල හිඟයකට යන්න නියමිතයි. ඒ හරහා ජීවිත අහිමි වෙන්න නියමිතයි. ඒත දෙවෙනි අභියෝගය තමයි මේ රටම මුහුණ දීලා තියෙන ඉන්ධන අර්බුදය. රෝහලකට අපි ඖෂධ මොන විදියකින් හරි සැපයුවක් ඒ ඖෂධ රෝගීන්ට ලබා දීම සඳහා සෞඛ්‍ය සේවකයන් රෝහල තුල ඉන්න ඕන. විශේෂඥ වෛද්‍යවරයාගේ ඉඳන් කනිෂ්ඨකාර මණ්ඩලය දක්වා මේ සියලු දෙනාටම රෝහලේ තමන්ගේ කැපකිරීම කරනවට වඩා වැඩි කාලයක් කැප කරන්න වෙලා තියෙන්නේ තෙල් පොලිමේ. තෙල් පොලිමේ රැඳී හිටපු කාලේ ඇත්තටම ගිය සතියට සාපේක්ෂව මේ සති වැඩි වෙලා ගොඩක් තැන්වල. සමහර තැන්වල පැය 24කට ආසන්න කාලයක්ම විශේෂඥ වෛද්‍යවරුන්ටත් පොලිමේ ඉන්න උනා තෙල් ටික ගහ ගන්න. සමහර සේවාවන් ඊයේ දවස්වල අඩාල වුණා. සමහර රෝහල් වල බාහිර රෝගී අංශය සම්පූර්ණ අකාර්මණ්‍ය වුණා ඊයේ දවස්වල. සමහර රෝහල් වල සායන නතර කරන්න සිද්ධ වුණා. සමහර රෝහල් වල අත්‍යවශ්‍ය ශල්‍ය කර්ම ඇරුණාම එදිනෙදා කරන ශල්‍ය කර්ම පරක්කු කරන්න සිද්ධ වුණා. තව සති කිහිපයක් එක දිගට මේක කරන්න බෑ.
Meanwhile, a tense situation arose between Air Force personnel and people queued up at a refilling station in Moratuwa after the Air Force personnel tried to remove a group of people who were behaving in an unruly manner. The group had attempted to obtain fuel from the refilling station without tokens. In the meantime, people waiting in queue at a refilling station in Bandaragama were disgruntled after filling station staff announced that the stocks of fuel received had finished. The people claimed that the stocks diminished fast because police personnel kept refilling their vehicles continuously. With Lanka IOC being the only distributor of fuel for the general public, queues outside refilling stations are reportedly longer, especially today due to the start of the weekend. In other developments, Lanka IOC announced today that shipments of petrol and diesel are expected to arrive in the country this month and in August. According to the managing director of Lanka IOC, Ranjan Mohapatra, the first shipment is expected to arrive between the 13th and the 15th of July. The second shipment is expected to reach the island between the 29th and the 31st of July, while the final shipment is scheduled to arrive between the 10th and the 15th of August.
Privately owned LPG supplier Laughs Gas plc announced that it is taking measures to expand the distribution process of domestic gas cylinders to its customers. Yesterday, state-owned Litro Gas assured that it was well in place to carry out uninterrupted supply of domestic cooking gas for a period of 1.5 years. Litro chairman told AdaDerana that it had received instructions and cabinet approval to issue another tender for gas procurement sufficient for 12 months in addition to the 100,000 metric ton supply purchased earlier for the period from July to October. This means Sri Lanka will have LPG supplies until November 2023, ridding the country of queues for domestic gas.
Laughs Gas plc, which caters to a share of 30% of the market's customer base, announced today that it is taking necessary measures to expand product distribution operations to expeditiously provide gas cylinders to its customers. Issuing a statement to media, the company said it was recently faced with severe challenges to importing LP gas for commercial, industrial and domestic purposes due to the forex shortage in the country. Laughs Gas also said that meeting the demand became challenging as the company was unable to open letters of credit for several months to import LPG. Following continuous discussions with the state-owned and commercial banks, however, Laughs Gas has managed to open letters of credit required for LPG imports. The company went on to say that imported LP gas stocks are now being filled into cylinders at its refilling terminals, and these cylinders will be issued to the market through its dealers soon. Laughs Gas decided to distribute LP gas cylinders to its customers directly in a bid to prevent irregularities in the process. In its statement, Laughs Gas said that there have been reports about a fraudulent syndicate selling Laughs cylinders above the prices declared by the company. People can report of such incidents through its hotline 1345. In the meantime, joining the AdaDerana English news yesterday, Chairman of the Litro Gas Lanka Limited, Mudita Piris, said that the company was set to issue a new tender for 12 months for gas procurement, expressing confidence that it will be able to help put an end to queues for domestic gas by August.
Confirmed shipment coming on the 6th afternoon where we are expecting to start the distributing the cylinders by 7th afternoon or 7th evening. And then we have another shipment coming on the 10th afternoon, which will come with another 3,700. The first one also with 3,700 metric tons. And then 15th, we'll have another 3,200 confirmed shipment. And again, 19th or rather 20th morning, we will have another shipment for another 3,700. After 20th, we'll be getting every 2 days, sometimes every other day, we will be getting shipments up to 31st, and the plan is to complete with 33,000 odd metric tons for the month of July. I'm very confident that we should be able to get rid of all the queues by end of the month, or maximum it will take up to about 2nd, 3rd of August, we should be able to get rid of all the queues. There's a recent cabinet decision giving us instruction to float a new tender for the next 12 months, which will start from the 1st of November to 23rd November. Right. So we'll be floating that tender also. It will be published on papers a week after next also. So that will cover for the 12 months from November to 23rd November. With this format, there will be 16 months. The new agreement will cover all 16 months with the current agreement.
The Japanese embassy in Colombo today issued a statement offering clarity on the stance of the Japanese government on Sri Lanka while dispelling information by international media. The embassy in its statement said that Japan has had a relationship with Sri Lanka that has stood the test of time, and as a show of good faith and its support to the island nation, it provided Sri Lanka with an emergency funding of $3 million to import medicine and food needed for the people of Sri Lanka.
Issuing a statement, the Embassy of Japan in Sri Lanka clarified its stance on Sri Lanka regarding recent news articles that claim that Japan was not willing to help the country until the current government led by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe steps down. In its statement, the Japanese embassy in Colombo noted that Japan is closely paying attention to the current difficult economic situation in Sri Lanka and severe humanitarian situation accompanied. It went on to say that considering such situations, the government of Japan has decided to provide an emergency grant of $3 million through the UNICEF and the World Food Programme in order to provide medicine and food in a manner that would directly benefit the Sri Lankan people. The embassy stated that it sincerely hopes that this assistance will help to overcome the hardship faced by the people of Sri Lanka, Japan's long-standing friends. The government of Japan would like to consider its further contribution to Sri Lanka in consultation with the government of Sri Lanka and other developing partners, while giving attention to the situation of Sri Lanka and the negotiation progress between the country and the International Monetary Fund. The Japanese embassy concluded that Japan is a time-tested partner in Sri Lanka's socio-economic development and has been supporting Sri Lanka and will continue to do its part in combining its efforts with the people and the government of the country.
Any deal with Sri Lanka should be contingent with critical reforms. Details after this break.
Big 3.
Welcome back to the news. The United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee says the International Monetary Fund's agreement with Sri Lanka should be contingent on critical reforms. In a tweet, the Senate committee said that the IMF deal with Sri Lanka must be contingent on central bank independence, strong anti-corruption measures, and the promotion of the rule of law, without which the country could suffer further.
The US State Foreign Relations Committee, in a remark in response to a recent tweet by the International Monetary Fund, said any IMF agreement with Sri Lanka must be contingent on Central Bank of Sri Lanka's independence, strong anti-corruption measures, and the promotion of the rule of law. The IMF tweet read, "The aim of the new IMF program is to restore economic stability and debt sustainability while protecting the most vulnerable, safeguarding the financial stability, and stepping up reforms to address corruption vulnerabilities so that Sri Lanka can meet its full potential." Quoting the IMF tweet, the Senate committee warned that without these critical reforms, Sri Lanka could suffer further economic mismanagement and uncontrollable debt. The IMF, upon concluding its staff mission to Sri Lanka for bailout talks from June 20th to the 30th, stated that talks with Sri Lankan authorities made significant progress on defining a macroeconomic and structural policy package. The mission team by Peter Brewer and Mashiro Nozaki to Colombo held discussion with key authorities in Sri Lanka to assess the country's situation and the path towards an IMF reform program. The delegation also reaffirmed its commitment to support Sri Lanka at this difficult time in line with the IMF's policies.
Right now, Sri Lanka is having talks with the International Monetary Fund for the 17th time to secure a loan agreement, a bailout package in a bid to overcome the ongoing economic crisis. And the IMF team just concluded their in-person visit for bailout talks with Sri Lanka, reaffirming their commitment to help Sri Lanka in line with IMF policies, as they have stressed. Now, I've invited to our studios to discuss how Sri Lanka can possibly effectively implement a future IMF program, Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore and former member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and Director of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute, Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you for having me on your show, Indivari.
We're just trying to understand now, for a long time Sri Lanka was talking about going to the IMF, and then there was a delay there, and finally we've had talks. This could be the 17th bailout package or a standby arrangement with the International Monetary Fund, if I'm not mistaken. How, in your view, should Sri Lanka work with the IMF going forward once the deal is struck?
So the only solution to Sri Lanka's deep economic crisis is an IMF program of something like $3 to $4 billion, probably implemented over 3 years. And this program will entail some tax rises, better tax administration, higher interest rates, higher utility prices, but the expenditure side is protected, so the welfare of the poor will be looked at carefully in this program, and then there will be strong anti-corruption measures. The world is really watching Sri Lanka very carefully and is also supportive. Now, the fly in the ointment for the program is that we have to complete some element of debt sustainability with our creditors. And this will involve quite complex negotiations with private creditors as well as China. And I think they will also be expecting us to have a political consensus in Sri Lanka that we want an IMF program and that we want to come out of this crisis in a sustainable and debt positive manner, that we are actually able to perform properly in the future.
Now, Dr. Ganesh Raja, we've been hearing the IMF saying that Sri Lanka's debt, there should be adequate assurances from the Sri Lankan side of sustainable debt to our creditors. What does this process entail? What would it look like? It looks like a cumbersome process for Sri Lanka. There's a lot of work needed, and we just heard of a tweet by the US Senate committee saying that any deal with Sri Lanka that the IMF enters should be contingent on certain critical reforms. How do you think we should take the first few steps towards this?
So the sad part is we delayed going to the IMF. All of last year we were talking about homegrown solutions which have sadly failed, and we lost critical time. What steps are involved now that we have appointed a law firm and a debt advisor is that they will have to conduct independent discussions with our creditors. And it is complicated because of the nature of creditors involved. Now, once some kind of deal has been struck with some of these creditors, we hope that the IMF board will then approve a program for Sri Lanka. What will happen in Sri Lanka was what they call a staff level agreement, hopefully, some progress towards this. And this will have to be formalized in a document and taken to the IMF board, and they will approve it. Now, we don't know how long this process will take. And in the interim, Sri Lanka will have to look for bridging finance to pay for essential fuel, food, medicine imports, as well as pay for other important items that we want to have the economy to perform well in the future.
In your expertise, how will the situation play out? We're seeing protests in Libya. We're seeing Pakistan falling into a crisis situation. In the United States and in the UK, we see soaring prices, inflation in record highs. And in Sri Lanka, of course, we saw the crisis months or maybe an year prior to other countries facing it. But how will this turn out to be, especially when we talk about a recession around the corner?
So the world economy is probably going to enter a recessionary phase. And this sort of makes life a bit harder for a country like Sri Lanka because there are others indeed in need. Some 60% of low-income countries globally are facing risk of debt distress. And there are huge demands on a major investor in infrastructure such as China to forgive debt or to give moratoria. So we are entering this cycle a bit late. However, we are not out of the game in the sense that if we are able to conclude some discussion with our creditors and get an IMF program and build a political consensus in Sri Lanka, we, I think, have a sporting chance of success because of the geographical location of Sri Lanka in the middle of the Indian Ocean and a broadly market-oriented, business-friendly economy. But we'll have to do much, much better if we want to ensure success in the future.
You spoke about the geographic importance of the island nation, the strategic location. Again, we have superpowers involved in Sri Lanka helping us through this crisis. That again takes us back to the concerns we had previously about the kind of economic influence exerted by these countries and the influence on our sovereignty and integrity of the nation. As an expert and an economist, what and how do you look at this situation?
So Sri Lanka is now really at the bottom of the pale, and we have really dropped quite far. And we are in a development nightmare, the way I see it presently. So beggars can't be choosy, sadly, at this point, and we have to accept whatever help is available to us. India has stepped in as a first responder with $3.5 billion. There will be a price to pay, probably, in terms of providing market access to Sri Lankan production here, Indian investment coming in, and probably greater integration with India. China, if it forgives our debt, will also extract a price from us. So we're in a very difficult state. The recommendation I would give to government is that we pursue a strictly neutral foreign policy where we try to stress proposals on their merits, but with a view to bringing Sri Lanka out of this crisis. We have delayed, sadly, too long, and I think now it's time to get serious with an IMF program, a neutral foreign policy, and then a second generation of reforms to make this economy market-oriented so that we can provide the foundation for our children and our grandchildren so they can prosper and achieve the kind of future we want Sri Lanka to have.
Finally, the humanitarian aid that's flowing into the country, how do we ensure that these countries continue to support Sri Lanka throughout this difficult time?
So Sri Lanka needs to do two things to ensure that the humanitarian aid is well managed. The first is we have to ensure that this aid goes island-wide to all sections of the country and all sections of the population of the country. Secondly, we have to ensure that this aid is corruption-free and properly distributed and properly accounted for. The sad fact is if we do not do this, and we are being watched very, very carefully, people may not be that generous and other countries may not be generous, and Sri Lankan people will be in a greater plight than we are today. So one would urge the politicians to be fully accountable for every dollar that comes in and make sure it goes to the suffering people. Right outside the studio we have 3-mile-long petrol queues where drivers have been spending 3 nights there, and I talked to some of them recently, and there is immense frustration on the street. And my worry in this recovery scenario is that political discontent will play a great role. So one urges the government to take this whole seriously and move ahead with the right steps that we have just discussed.
Since you're here, I'd like to ask you one more question about the IMF. You've had experiences working with international agencies and the global financial lender's presence in Sri Lanka. Will there be any complications for Sri Lanka, especially when there are requirements that Sri Lanka should comply with? Will this be something that Sri Lanka could adhere to?
So I think we need to look at the conditions very carefully and develop internal mechanisms to try to implement these conditions. We don't want this program to be a failure. And one condition will be anti-corruption, which I think we'll have to look at very seriously. The other will be better tax administration. And as I said, this is a fairly mild IMF program, and I think it's up to us to try to implement it effectively.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and expertise here on AdaDerana English News.
My pleasure to be with you, Indivari.
We had with us Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, Senior Fellow at the National University of Singapore and former member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Director of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute as well. We'll take a short break here on First at 9 and be right back with more news. Welcome back. Sri Lanka and India have agreed to form a study group with a view to look into the way forward for cooperation in the dairy sector. The decision was taken during discussions between Sri Lankan High Commissioner in New Delhi, Milinda Moragoda, and India's Minister of Food Processing Industries, Prashupati Kumar Paraz, yesterday.
Sri Lanka and India have agreed to explore further avenues towards greater cooperation in the food processing and dairy sectors. The matter was taken up for discussion when Sri Lanka's High Commission to India, Milinda Moragoda, met with India's Minister of Food Processing Industries, Prashupati Kumar Paraz, in New Delhi yesterday. The Indian minister has assured that the Indian government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi is always ready to help Sri Lanka in these difficult times. High Commissioner Moragoda has stressed on the importance of establishing close linkages between India and Sri Lanka in various sectors under the minister's purview, in particular the dairy industry. The Indian minister and the Sri Lankan High Commissioner have agreed that cooperation could commence with the dairy sector, and it could later be expanded into other sectors falling under the supervision of the Ministry of Food Processing Industries. High Commissioner Moragoda said that the ultimate objective of these efforts would be greater economic integration of the two countries. With a view of looking into the way forward for cooperation in these sectors, it was decided to form a study group that would comprise officials from the Indian Ministry of Food Processing Industries and the High Commission of Sri Lanka, as well as other relevant stakeholders from both India and Sri Lanka. It was also decided to have the first meeting of the study group soon.
The US stock market is reeling from its worst first half of any year since 1970, with investors finding a series of potential flashpoints in July that may set Wall Street's course for the coming months. Second quarter corporate earnings, anticipated US inflation data, and the Federal Reserve's monetary policy meeting are among potentially pivotal events after the S&P 500 fell 20.6% in the initial 6 months of 2022. Bonds, which investors count on to offset stock declines, have tumbled alongside equities, with the Treasury index on pace for its worst year in the index history. Some 90% of the respondents in a recent Deutsche Bank survey expected a US recession by the end of 2023. Now, China announced another stimulus measure to finance infrastructure projects, part of its push to drive investment and increase employment in the second half of this year as the economy starts to recover from the effects of COVID lockdowns. The government will raise $44.8 billion to finance infrastructure projects by selling financial bonds and other methods. Those bonds are usually sold by policy banks. The money will be used to replenish the capital of major projects such as new types of infrastructure. These types of financial tools can help expand effective investment drive, employment and facilitate consumption, and flow China to stick to its stance of not flooding the economy with stimulus or overprinting money. That's all for tonight. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.